Thanks, Hope. I'm Marian Erickson. I'm host of the Plant-Based Briefing podcast, and I'm honored to be part of the Humane Hoax project team. It's near and dear to my heart. And I'm pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Joanne Kong. I loved her chapter in the Humane Hoax anthology, so I can't wait to hear from her today. She is praised throughout the world as one of the most compelling advocates for veganism. She's given presentations at numerous vegan events, summits, and conferences. Joanne has written books and has a TEDx talk called The Power of Plant-Based Eating. And her edited anthology, Vegan Voices, Essays by Inspiring Changemakers, is also an ambitious book with over 50 animal advocacy writers, all with different journeys and experiences and unique forms of activism. It's really great. So we're fortunate to have Joanne here with us today. Thank you, Joanne, and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marian, and it's great to be here with everybody and Hope. So am I able to now share my screen, Hope? There, can everybody see that?
Yes, that's working. Thank you.
And how interesting that Vasily and I both picked the same graphic for our topic. So I'm so glad to be here to talk about disconnection and the role of perception in the humane hoax. So the origins of the humane hoax are clearly tied to altered perceptions rooted in the development of the herding culture. Now, prior to the establishment of tribal and agrarian societies, we know that humans lived as opportunistic eaters, gathering, they were hunting and scavenging for food. And in this existence, humans actually existed with other animals in a complex web of life. They were highly observant of non-human animals' unique abilities, and they were fascinated by them and the powers that they seemed to hold. But as human culture developed, we, of course, saw a shift in this relationship. Along with a rise in population, people began to abandon nomadic lifestyles, seeking and settling in places where food, shelter, and land for growing crops were available. Agriculture slowly took hold, as did the concept of ownership. And this was not only of land, but of animals as well, beginning with cows, sheep, and goats. This marked a critical change in our perceptions of animals. Humans began seeing them not as kindred beings, but as commodities, objects, and tools for our use. So the ultimate rise of urbanization and consumerism, which shaped the foundations of what our culture is today, served only to reinforce this view of animals as mere units of production within industries whose sole goals were efficiency and profit. This change in the perception of humans towards non-human animals thus created this hierarchy, right? The sense that all beings are not equal in status. Rather, human animals assumed a position of superiority. Accepted was the notion of non-human animals as others, less deserving of compassion and respect. I love this following quote by writer Michael Mountain. He says, quote, "I am not an animal. Over thousands of years, we humans have sought to separate ourselves from the rest of nature, to see ourselves as superior and exceptional. We don't even like to be reminded of the fact that we are animals. They are animals, we are humans. As long as we're in denial about our own animal nature, almost any effort to treat our fellow animals with the respect we grant each other is doomed to fail." So that's from Michael Mountain. So with this accepted position of dominion over other animals, together with the human need to feel that their actions are justified, this has led to the contradictory nature of the human hoax. Regardless of the circumstances and conditions in which animals are raised, Nothing should distract us from this central truth that these innocent animals are victims of exploitation. Their lives culminate in a violent death at our hands. How can this ever be considered humane? This lies at the core of what all manifestations of the humane hoax are: distractions from and distortions of the most atrocious acts of cruelty and violence ever exacted upon another species and many species. So, in order to gain a little more insight into the personal choices people make regarding animals and diet, we can examine more closely how human nature, perceptions, and behaviors tie into the humane hoax. So, what are some of these aspects? There's the aspect of change. For the most part, I think pretty much all of us can agree that humans are generally reluctant to change long established habits. Even though deep down, on some level, all of us are aware about what lies behind exploiting animals for food, eating them is the status quo. It's like the path of least resistance, something that is normal, that most people do without question. For many of us, myself included, it was simply how we were brought up. It was part of our daily family life, our traditions, and our culture. Liking the taste of animal flesh tied in with these accepted habits. One of the writers in Vegan Voices, his name is Jesse Tandler, and he wrote in his essay the following. He said, quote, "Animals tasted like I was supposed to eat them," unquote. So that speaks to the fact that we inherit so many of these behaviors and attitudes from our family traditions and our parents, and we accept them, we like them, and we don't question them. The absurd notion of the humane hoax that there can even be such a thing as happy meat, in essence, gives consumers a false rationale for not changing their lifestyle practices. There's the desire for a sense of security, stability, and validation. And you see it in this graphic, this picture of the happy family around the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? I think all of us have within us this inborn desire to fit in, right? To conform as a way to feel comfortable and even validated. Psychiatrist Joanne Kong points out that, quote, "If we're doing the same as everyone else, we must be doing it right. And finding a reflection of ourselves in those around us is a form of validation. The need for acceptance is a basic human instinct," unquote. So these acquired customs and habits regarding animals have been continually reinforced, and that is a challenge we advocates constantly face. Unfortunately, vegans are still a minority, and on a daily basis, we see the messaging all around us in advertisements, food establishments, stores, all of the graphics that Vasily was showing. We're constantly being bombarded with these messages that using animals is normal, the way things are supposed to be. And it all ties into that part of human nature that we want to feel good about ourselves, right? And the humane hoax feeds on this aspect of human nature in influencing the purchasing decisions of consumers. A large part of these choices connects to what we can call the emotional value of the product. In other words, how it makes the consumer feel. We are, after all, emotional beings. And we naturally feel drawn, right, to make a purchase if we perceive we are doing good in the process. Thus, where animals and animal products are concerned, buyers are deceptively led into the trap of making choices that are anything but humane. So, of course, we've all seen these products in the grocery store. Think about all the labels: free range, cage free, free roaming, grass fed, pasture raised, high welfare, certified humane, animal welfare approved. This particular carton, you see that the cow looks very happy, smiling, all to deceive the consumer. Sadly, such terms that we see continue to deceive consumers into believing they are making ethical food choices, when in actuality, there is not only an astounding lack of oversight, regulation, and consistency in such claims, but there's this built-in ambiguity that misleads consumers. For example, 63% of Americans believe that free-range chickens live outdoors in natural settings, when we know, in fact, that the birds are crammed together in horrifying indoor warehouse facilities. They're suffering from fear, debilitating injuries, and industry standard mutilations. Marketing ploys are aimed at appealing to buyers' feel good perceptions, but of course do nothing to erase the fact that these animals are brutally killed at a fraction of their natural lifespans. There's also the tendency of humans to focus on what's just right in front of us, what's immediate, what we concern ourselves with in our everyday lives. And so what goes on behind the scenes of factory farming is largely invisible. It's not placed at the front of our awareness. The factory farms where animals are slaughtered and turned into food, there's a reason why we don't see these facilities. They're always in remote areas. Federal and state agencies don't list their addresses. And think about it. You're out in the country driving, you can see large expanses of farmland. We can even go pick our own fruits and vegetables, but we don't know where slaughterhouses and packing facilities are. The hidden suffering of the animals makes it easier for the public to accept false depictions. And we've all already talked about all of the many misleading marketing images. In fact, just the other day, I was driving on the highway and I saw this huge grocery store truck pass me, and its entire length was covered with the image of huge rolling grassy hills with happy hens. This is what they want us to see, not the truth of what happens. And think about when you're in the grocery store. It's called generic meat, pork, and not a pig, beef or steak, and not a cow, and animal flesh is attractively packaged, further removing us from the realities of cruelty and death. So as consumers, we're allowed to, or we actually are allowing ourselves to be in this state of denial and to become disconnected from what we would likely feel if we actually witnessed firsthand what was happening. And you even hear terminology like, oh, that's a lab rat, we have circus animals, farm animals, all with the intrinsic implication that these animals serve a utilitarian purpose. There's also another aspect called psychic numbing, described by psychologist and sociologist Melanie Joy and others. We tend to disconnect from instances of loss or death that are happening on a massive scale. We do not see the animals as individuals. Instead, they're part of this immense anonymous group, like, oh, they're just a bunch of animals. We're led to see not the individual, but this kind of impersonal mass. It's kind of scary and awful to realize that over 110 billion humans have ever lived on this earth. Yet we've managed to overlook with indifference how humanity kills every single year trillions of innocent land and sea animals. Some of you may be familiar with the animal activist and writer Jim Mason. He uses this term, self-anesthetization. We've somehow managed to become totally numbed to all of this cruelty. And the public also remains comfortably distanced from slaughterhouse workers who themselves are also victims. And I wanted to be sure to talk about them. Timothy Pastorat, when he was a grad student at Yale, worked undercover for 5 months in a Midwest slaughterhouse, and he wrote a book called Every 12 Seconds. And you can see how in this facility, there is a specific job for each worker. And he writes the following, quote, exploring industrialized killing from this vantage point draws attention to the distance we create through walls, screens, catwalks, fences, security checkpoints, and geographic zones of isolation and confinement. It reveals the distance we create by constructing and reinforcing racial, gender, citizenship, and education hierarchies that coerce others into performing dangerous, demeaning, and violent tasks from which we directly benefit. It makes visible the distance we create with language in the ways we avoid precise descriptions of repugnant things, inventing instead less dangerous names and phrases for them, unquote. This is a headline from The Guardian in May 2020 during the pandemic, and you probably saw a lot of these headlines about millions of US farm animals. And instead of saying that they are killed or slaughtered, you have these words like they are cold or they are depopulated. So again, it's a matter of how we are so distant from the cruelty that these animals suffer. And during COVID, it was the idea that, oh, how are we going to survive without our meat? And it just perpetuated this false narrative that consuming animals is necessary to a functioning society. Humans also cope by avoiding what's known as cognitive dissonance. That's a situation in which decisions or behaviors are in conflict with our core values or beliefs. So, case in point, people continue to eat animals, even though on some level they know that meat production entails unnecessary suffering, violence, and death. So, in order to avoid the conflict or dissonance of this inconsistency, they simply refuse to acknowledge what's going on. Some of we advocates have had this very common experience where we're trying to educate others and say, this is what's happening to these animals. And oftentimes the response is something like, oh, don't tell me, I don't want to think about it. So by distancing themselves from the conflict, this allows them to continue their food habits without a sense of guilt or complicity. In doing so, they easily become influenced by the myth that there is such a thing as humane exploitation, and thus they continue their complicity. The humane hoax also creates false equivalencies, and some of these Vasile already addressed. The false notion that, oh, if it's an animal from a small or local farm, it must be humane. But it doesn't matter where the animal spends his or her short life. The end result is the same, that they are killed. And through their commodification, any recognition of their individuality and will to live has been violated. And it's so tragic that on these small farms, there's sometimes very deep connections of trust forged between the animal and his or her owner, only to be horrifically betrayed when it comes time for the animal to be slaughtered. On the right side, you see these have become very popular, these kind of mobile slaughter units. And it says, mobile abattoirs bring humane slaughter straight to the farm. I mean, this is so horrific. And in fact, some of these so-called do-it-yourself slaughter contraptions, because people don't know how to use them, supposedly, it winds up that there are horrific botched killings that are even more cruel. It's just really horrifying that there are these things. So at this point, I'd like to share an aspect that's a little bit more personal, in which I talk about how I grew up and how, for me, animal parts lying on a plate represented culinary excellence. Now, this is a picture on the right of my aunt. She's no longer living, but my father and my aunt both had reputations as superb cooks. In fact, Pearl was praised as the Julia Child of Cantonese cuisine, and she wrote one of the most comprehensive books on Chinese cuisine. So I have many memories of these intricate Chinese dishes, names like shark's fin soup, chicken feet, beef tongue, fish balls, pig's feet, and more. And she would also use animals that were less known to be used in culinary dishes, such as squab, duck, lamb, even octopus. And so there's this perceptual disconnect that these are not living, beautiful creatures, but they're items that can be used to represent culinary excellence. And of course, I look back with deep shame that I was so unaware. I was just so numbed from even thinking about this. Yet at the same time, it kind of gives me a chance to say, hey, this was my perspective. I grew up, I was in essence brainwashed to thinking that I didn't have to think about these animals. So oftentimes I'll use this example about how strong the cultural conditioning can be. So I wanted to end with a happier picture. And the question you all may be asking, those of you that are watching this webinar today, is, well, what can we do? And I think back to, this was fairly recently, there was an interview that Jeff Adams did on Vegan Linked of Wayne Shung. And those of you know that he has faced many trials and is facing more trials for rescuing animals from farms. And in this interview, he says something that is so wonderful. He says, the best thing about ourselves is our kindness, how we can relate to other living beings. And this is what we really need to promote, because right now, the deeply ingrained acceptance of exploiting animals is so present, yet at the same time, it's unseen. I often describe it as an invisible thread running through the fabric of our lives. And sadly, most people have come to accept it. And we've heard so many stories, and it's become more and more open to the public that animals have remarkable sentient abilities. In fact, most recently, it was shown that fish can pass the mirror test. In other words, they can self-recognize themselves. But even regardless of what our unique abilities are, whether as humans or as animals, it's the capability of sentience, the ability to have subjective conscious awareness, to have intentions, emotions, and the desire to live that is at the core of how we should see animals. Here's a picture of me with one of my favorite pigs. Her name is Vegan, and this is at Rivers Wish Animal Sanctuary in Spokane, Washington. And I'd like to just kind of close by saying, we must do what we can to change the culture that has allowed so many to live in a state of deep disconnection from our kindred animals, numbed from seeing them as worthy individuals with the same behaviors we all share and value as sentient beings. There's a wonderful quote that I like to close with by global health pioneer Dr. Paul Farmer. He says it best. He says, "The idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that's wrong with the world." Thanks.
Thank you, Joanne, so much. Really, really powerful. Yeah, so I love that picture, and I love that that pig's name is Vegan. That's great. Wonderful. Well, so we are getting questions coming in, and one thing that I was struck when you were talking about your cultural food, the food that you were raised with, and that there was a lot of culinary, um, you know, uh, culture around your upbringing. And one thing that was mentioned was that sometimes not so usual animals were used, other animals like octopus or, and we often get a feeling, I think people get a feeling that if it's not a chicken or a cow, that somehow it must be more humane. Somehow they must have been, more humanely raised. Can you talk a little about that, about the different animals and how, it doesn't really matter, but if you want
Yeah,
to.
right. I think it's just that with certain animals that humans are not as familiar with, it's so easy to point out how different they are from us. And I think about how so many people on their vegan journey, they, go first vegetarian and they'll say, "Oh, well, I'm still eating fish." And to a lot of people, because we don't see fish every day, they're in the oceans, they're underwater, they're very, very different from us. And because they look different from us, we can easily think of them as, well, they're not as good as us, or they're not as subjectively sentient as we are. So somehow, because we can perceive them as being more removed from our awareness, I think perhaps that's where that idea comes from. And it's also the whole idea of, oh, well, it's an unusual source of food. It's even more of a delicacy because it's so unusual.
Right. Right. And that's where you can get into interesting things, like one of our speakers from last year, Robert Jones, was talking about, the foodie culture and locavorism, and getting into kind of, that specialty market stuff, where you think it's very special. And so somehow that eliminates the cruelty or the environmental impact, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and think about just not necessarily even just with animals, but with marketing in general. Like new and improved, or this is the new version of this car, or this is something especially for you. Right away, the
Yeah.
marketers, they connect with that, natural response within ourselves that we want to feel like we're special. We want to feel like the companies are thinking about us. So they use these clever ways to draw us in. And so as consumers, we just need to be smarter. We need to really think about what is really going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question here from Stacy. I'll read it. Aside from counter advertising, counter marketing, what recommendations do you have to shine a light on the deep disconnect we live with as an animal dominating, abusing, eating culture? People like to think of themselves as intelligent and well informed and kind. How do we counter that? How do we leverage that?
Yeah, I think just in our everyday lives, because we connect with so many of our friends and family. And I always tell advocates starting out that one of the fun things you can do is, like, say around Thanksgiving, create your own Thanksgiving get together, invite a bunch of friends over, and you don't even have to tell them that the food is vegan. Um, and they'll, of course, rave about your cooking and say, "Oh, that was so delicious." And then you can say, "Hey, I didn't even, not one animal was killed for this. And I just went to the grocery store, I went to the produce department, and there's the wonderful rainbow of fruits and vegetables. And we can find our nourishment from these beautiful plants and not even have to go near the meat aisle. So another thing I guess I should mention too, that in a way this is good. I mean, you take a grocery store chain like Kroger, which of course does sell meat, does still animal flesh, but they're even putting, I don't buy the product that much, but Beyond Meat and Impossible Meat, they actually are putting those products right next to where the animal products are. So at least that's something positive because it's sort of like, well, gee, I've kind of heard of Beyond Meat. Maybe I'll give that a try. So, you know, I always tell people, don't just assume things, do explorations, walk around the grocery store. I mean, I think there are some positive signs, and that's just one of them. And I hope it continues.
Yeah. Yeah, that there's kind of that debate about whether there should be a whole separate vegan area where just a vegan can go to get their meat and cheese and yogurt and everything. Or should we put the yogurts over by the yogurt and put the meat over by the meat? And and I think that we should do that, even though as vegans, like we don't want to have to go to the meat department to get products. I know that's, but we want the meat the people that are going to buy the meat to know it's there, to know what their options are. So I wish they could put it in both places. But
And isn't it true that as vegans, once we're used to shopping at a certain store, we make a beeline. We know exactly where to get this, and that. We don't even look at the other things. So,
right, right. And we don't want to. I don't want to have to. Right. So someone asked actually about your family, and it's Christine. She says, "Does your family now see that they can make most of the dishes that are tied to their culture in a cruelty-free way? Have you had any experience with your family trying to make the food cruelty-free?"
well, with my own family, it's really interesting. When I started doing vegan and animal advocacy, my older sister went vegan, and she hadn't even told me. So it kind of happened at the time that I was talking about all these things, and she didn't even realize I was advocating. Um, and she went vegan. Her husband was vegan for a short time, but then he reverted back, and his justification, and this is so crazy, he said, well, there's a nutrient in shrimp that I need to eat, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's like you almost could have found a better argument, it's just very unusual. But I always tell fellow advocates that you should never give up, and you never know what kind of an impact you're going to have. Like, I teach music here at the University of Richmond, and I coach students one-on-one. And there were two of the senior students I was having a conversation with last year. They were graduating and everything. And two of them said, oh, yeah, by the way, we're becoming vegan because we've been reading all your stuff and saw your TED talk. And I had like no idea. I mean,
Wow.
you just never know. Sometimes just by being an example and showing that you're a compassionate, loving person who just also happens to be vegan, sometimes that's the best way to inspire people to change.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, fantastic. Well, Joanne, thank you so much for
Well,
all that you do. Thank you for writing your chapter in our Humane Hoax anthology. We appreciate that and really appreciate your insights.
thank you.
Thank you.